doing okay today. Welcome to the Hardin Council Family Cemetery. Today we're going to take a look at material culture, particularly material culture in a southern Appalachian cemetery. So today we're going to take a look at the Hardin Council Family Cemetery on Howard Street behind Clemens Student Union. We want to do a few things today. First, we want to talk about southern Appalachian cemeteries. We want to talk about this particular cemetery, its history. We want to take a look at some of the elements in the cemetery, as well as the layout of the cemetery. And then I want to talk about how the cemetery can be a material mirror of Boone's society in the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century. So we're going to talk a little bit about gender, talk a little bit about age and iconography on tombstones and what it tells us about people's beliefs and ideas of death in the afterlife and memorialization of the departed. And then we're going to talk a little bit about race, because Boone was a segregated society, and that segregation does continue in how Boone residents buried their dead. To help me do that today, I am joined at a healthy, safe social distance by senior lecturer in general education Trent Margraf, who is a public historian and sometimes brings his classes in the before time to the same cemetery. Introduce yourself.
Sure. Trent Margraf, again, senior lecturer in general education, and for my courses on historic green buildings, time machine, cultural landscapes, the cemetery will work well as an overview on looking at landscape, change, and we'll look at one specific grave as we assess how we know the truth and facts as well.
All right, so we're going to get started. If you've ever been back here, this is the Hardin Council Family Cemetery. It's up behind, there's the back of the Student Union. There's the Honors College, and Trent, is that Cone Hall over there? That residence hall?
No, that summit right there.
Summit, and we teach architecture on campus. We should know this.
Not sure the other one.
Anyway, there is a residence hall right there. You all probably know it. If you want, leave it in the comments. I'd be curious to finally know, given how much I teach about the campus. Anyway, if you remember the local history lecture, I mentioned the Council family, so the name Hardin Council Cemetery might seem vaguely familiar to you. One time, the Council family and the Hardin family were the owners of what you see around us in downtown Boone, in the valley that downtown currently occupies. The Hardin family and the Council family were two of those early families, dating back certainly to the turn of the 19th century, around 1800 to certainly by 1820s. Hardin family and the Council family had this as their family cemetery, which was a common aspect of life and burial and death in Appalachia. The Council and Hardin family buried their dead in this cemetery, back there, below that streetlight. We're going to go visit that in a few minutes. But if you notice, there's quite a few other graves in this cemetery, so it's a little bit different than just a small family cemetery. Now, if you travel throughout Appalachia, you're going to find small family cemeteries, usually with a surname like the Adams Family Cemetery or the Smith Family Cemetery or the Eggers Family Cemetery, scattered all around Appalachia. This was a very common practice at the time, and if you notice something, there's a bit of landscape, particularly topography, to deal with where these family cemeteries were located. So if you've ever been up here, you might notice that this is not exactly a flat area. If we went to the very top of the cemetery, we could look around and see almost the entire valley of downtown Boone, Howard's Knob and the surrounding ridges. So yes, we're not down by a creek where things could flood. We're not in the middle of a farm pasture field where the cows can knock over the tombstones. We are up on a hill. We are at a high point of elevation on land that probably was part of the Hardin family's land at first. And they were, of course, joined by the Council family. They intermarried, and other major families joined them. So the cemetery itself, the Council family and the Hardin family, as I said, were around in the early 19th century. The earliest burial in the cemetery is from the Hardin family in the late 1850s, and a Council family burial in the early 1870s. But as you may notice, there's quite a few more stones here. And as you look around, some of these stones might seem somewhat familiar in terms of their surnames. Hey, look, right here, there's Eggers. In the background, right over there past the small tombstone with an American flag, is Farthing. There's another Farthing. And we're going to do this in just a moment. Way over there at that tall obelisk stone in the back, right there in front of that door neither I nor Trent Margriff know the name of, is a stone for Daniel B. Doherty. Remember him? Watauga Democrat, father of a couple of promising young men. Yeah, and those promising young men, B.B. and D.D. Doherty, are also buried here. So we're going to take a look at them today too. But if you notice, the cemetery does not only include the Council and the Hardin family, it includes all of these prominent families from Boone. Over the years, the cemetery expanded. If you've ever been to a cemetery, if one of your family members is buried in an older cemetery, you might have driven into that cemetery. You might have walked along curving pathways and seen shade trees and family plots arranged around curving pathways and benches. Do you see any of that here? As you look around, as I pan the camera, do you see any pathways? Any obvious ways that you're supposed to move through the cemetery? Now, yes, there's a gate over here, but once you get past that gate, we have steep drop-offs towards the staff parking lot and the student union, and down towards Cone Hall and the East End dorms. Basically, there is not that, what we call the rural cemetery movement influence in this cemetery. The idea of nature and roughness and curved lines that we saw at Central Park, or that folks like the father of American landscape architecture, Frederick Law Olmsted, introduced to our parks and our college campuses in the 19th century. Here we see a different spatiality of burials, and that's the first thing we want to look at. So, coming over here, gotta keep my appropriate social distance from Trent. We see the Stanberry family. So let's start taking a look at the elements of the cemetery landscape. So here we have the Stanberry family burials. There is a surname stone, or the family stone, with the last name, Stanberry, and you'll see that commonly throughout the cemetery. Notice the design of the stone itself. It has the surname in the center, and then on each edge there's iconography of vague floral patterns, some fern leaves perhaps, and a flower on each side. This surname stone design can match the design of the headstones for each member of the family. Sometimes that means that the family set the surname stone and then placed their burials. Other times, very often by the way, folks from the family were buried on the family plot, and then later a surname stone was purchased with a given design, and then the headstones of folks that were buried before the surname stone was placed then have new headstones placed with the same design. And we see that with the Stanberry family. So here's a few other things. Also, you'll notice, before we get to the specific headstones, there is a cornerstone marking the corner of the Stanberry family plot. You can see another surname stone back there, another over there, and look, back there is yet another S cornerstone. And that will be how this cemetery is laid out, family plot by family plot. Let's take a look now at some of the elements that we can see on a headstone. Here we have Molly Elizabeth Stanberry. So all of the headstones are going to tell us the name of the deceased that's perhaps buried here. We have the deceased's date of birth, in this case July 21st, 1879, and their date of death, March 18th, 1961. You see that repeating pattern from the surname stone of the fern leaves and flowers. Here's Sylvanus Oscar Stanberry, 1877 to 1957. And here is Mary Louise Stanberry, RN. RN? Ah, yes, registered nurse. Mary Louise Stanberry, registered nurse, daughter of Sylvanus Oscar and Molly E. Stanberry. Born 1911, died 1944. And then finally we have Helen Elizabeth Stanberry, 1906 to 1973. Keep Mary Louise in mind for later. Also notice that we have spacing for another headstone. In fact, in many of these family plots, families overbought. And so if you think about the spacing, you have space here. I could fit another stone. So as we move through the cemetery today, visualize the spacing of these stones. Because essentially, there is space for a stone here, and it would be about here. Yeah, stones up there, burial shaft, casket, all right about here. Okay? I may edit that out. We're going to move, and we're going to take a look at some other elements that we could tell about an individual and Boone Society from headstone iconography and epitaphs. Wesley Hardin Brown and his wife, Hattie Mast. If the Mast name sounds familiar, like there's a general store by that name, you're right. This is part of that larger early settlement of Mast families. You can see the iconography here, vegetal patterning with a flower at the top. And there's one additional element here. There's this thing here. Do you see that? A carpenter's L and a protractor. Clearly this was a carpenter. It's a mark of his... Okay, it wasn't his job. Wesley Hardin Brown was a mason. In fact, so too was William Roy Gragg. And quite a few others in the cemetery. Remember what I said earlier, that the cemetery expanded with some of the prominent families of Boone. Now we're going to look at a couple of other elements of iconography, and then start talking a little bit about gender, and move through the cemetery. We got to go visit BB and Dee Dee Doherty. Let's see, minister is this way, right? If I remember. Close. Okay.
And 5 things, I forgot what all those mean.
All right, here at the Oates headstone, if you know 1970s soft rock, the Hall family's down that way. But here's the Oates headstone, and if you notice the pentagram underneath of the surname for Floyd Cotterill Oates, that marks Mr. Oates as a member of another secret society like the Masons, in this case called the Oddfellows Society. And right next to Mr. Oates, the David Jones Cottrell and his wife Texie Edminston. If you know Edminston Farm, if you don't, you will know it in the landscape reconstruction project. But they're David Jones Cottrell, another Mason.
Alright, so, specific to one grave and how we know about people's lives and looking at truths, especially in our era of using Google and internet, for nearly everything, we have the grave of Rita Sheridan. And again, 21 years, died November 1908. This grave was erected by professional friends, it indicates, and you can go do some research, and it was erected 4 years later in 1912. And again, you might ask, okay, what's the point? Why is Rita Sheridan important? The Google search you want to do is Circus Girl. Circus Girl, Watauga County. Rita was in the traveling circus that had just been in Blowing Rock the night before, and Boone the day later, and then 3 months later she passed here in town, dying from pneumonia. And they buried her here in the cemetery. Now there was some controversy, however, because for people in the circus were not highly regarded, not highly respected. Specifically, women in the circus were thought to have been tainted, not pure, etc. So it took 4 years to basically have townspeople and locals and the Council Hardin family to agree that yes, Rita should be buried here, etc. Now, going online, you will find a newspaper article from 1972 that indicates she was the lead in the parade that went through town. As was typically happening across the country before the circus came, the elephant starts the parade, you showcase what will be featured at the circus venue, and Rita was riding an elephant's trunk. Well, that is not true and was later proven false. However, we can find pretty good images online of the parade itself, circuses, things like that, etc. So while that would add to the story, it's not entirely accurate. And you can see the grave marker itself is still in the same position it has been now for at least 30-some years. It has not been put back together, it has not been replaced, there is grass growing in between the break in it. So the larger sort of discussion I've had when we do cemetery tours, do we fix them? Do we clean them? Do we keep them in this condition? And that will be up to your generation. And the second largest question is, do we know about everyone who is buried here? Do we know the truth? Should we ever know the truth? And perhaps that's up for you guys to decide in the future.
Kind of a footer stone in the ground. The stone itself is for O. Lester Brown. One thing about Lester is, if you notice his surname stone, the side of the surname stone below the iconography is a marker indicating that Lester was a United Methodist minister. So another case of occupational status or society membership. One of the things you may notice around the cemetery, for most of the men buried here, and for most of the women buried here, their occupation is not mentioned on their headstone. However, for men that are buried in the Hardin Council Cemetery, it is much more likely that their occupation will be listed on their headstone. For women, it is much more likely than not that their status as a mother, a sister, a daughter will be listed on their headstone. In only 3 cases around the cemetery, you remember Mary Louise Stanberry, registered nurse? Well, here are our other 2 cases of this, where women have their occupation listed on their headstones. Lana Story Cook, 1885 to 1964, mother, teacher. And beside her, Nell Cook Woodall, 1915 to 1984, wife, mother, and nurse. Notice in each of these cases, occupation is listed, but so too is family role. Just like Mary Louise Stanberry was a registered nurse and also a daughter. I did promise you we'd visit with the Dohertys. So, I'm going to switch the camera around. Here is the Doherty obelisk. This has 2 individuals commemorated on it. Father Daniel B. Doherty, December 4th, 1833 to February 23rd, 1902. Also notice the degree to which the stone is eroding from years of acid rain, as well as the growth of moss and lichens on the stone that will crack over the years the surface of the stone, as well as freeze and thaw cycles. In some cases, freeze and thaw cycles can result in the complete cracking and toppling of stones, such as some of the stones here. Some of these early stones, by the way, were made in a way that it was just a single slab, and the slab would be buried in the ground, and over the years, any natural fissures or cracks in the material of the stone would lose its stability, and the headstone would then topple. If you remember the weather here in Boone, freeze and thaw cycles would often work these style of headstones out of the shaft in which they were placed. But let's get back to the Doherty stone. And here is the obelisk for Ellen C. Doherty, BB and Dee Dee's mother, born March 25th, 1845, died September 29th, 1876. And then over here is a surname stone for the Doherty family. And here is Lily Bell Scholl, wife of Dee Dee Doherty, 1874 to 1945. We've seen her statue in the memorial area created in Durham Park right before we disbanded. Here's Dolphin Disco Doherty, 1869 to 1929. And here is Blanford Bernard Doherty, October 1870 to May 27, 1957. Died in office, longest serving college president in North Carolina history. All right, we have one more thing to do. That's over here, so let's go. So we are right now at the edge of the Council Harton Family Cemetery, but we're not at the edge. Here's the thing. Up until about 3 years ago, the boundaries of the cemetery were a bit of a different place than today. If you look around today, past the trench, down the line, you see this nice new fencing surrounding the cemetery, all the way down through this oddly empty area. Right here on this line, 3 years ago, was a fence that surrounded this part of the cemetery, leaving that grassy area of the cemetery empty. That's because that line that was maintained by the town of Boone until 3 years ago separated the white side of the cemetery from the black side of the cemetery. Yeah, even in death, Boone remained a segregated community. The black side of the cemetery, by local tradition, has two things I want to tell you about. One, by local tradition, the black side of the cemetery was begun as the council family's burial ground for the people they had enslaved. This was a slave cemetery. Over time, it expanded to free African Americans living in Boone. And then by the 1950s, 1960s, the black community of Boone congregated around the Junaluska neighborhood to the northwest of downtown Boone, started burying their dead elsewhere. The other story from local legend is, if you remember our local history lecture, I mentioned the raid in 1864 by General George Stoneman, where U.S. forces came into Boone, traveling on their way from Knoxville, Tennessee, and was the mission of disrupting the backcountry of North Carolina, destroying railroad tracks, bridges, and raiding farms in order to create a kind of scorched earth area should Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia have to retreat down into North Carolina. Now, it didn't come to that. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865.
Yes, Captain Lovell was present at the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, of which Lovell Hall is named after currently.
Yes, and don't forget that that's including our first level home, our second level home, and our third level hall. Something you'll have to worry about in the landscape reconstruction project. Anyway, so if you remember that story, there was a pitched battle. It was Boone's shining moment of Civil War glory. And the Yankees ran off with their tails between their legs. And their dead were unceremoniously dumped in a mass grave in the quote-unquote black section of the Council Family Cemetery. Well, here's those burials. We have J.E. Miracle, Company H of the 2nd North Carolina Mounted Infantry, 1865. H.P. Ewins, Company F of the 2nd North Carolina Mounted Infantry, April 1865. And W.F. Bradley, Company H of the 2nd North Carolina Mounted Infantry, April 1865. 3 burials. And you may be asking, wait a minute, what are they doing with North Carolina mounted infantry, North Carolinians, proud sons of the South and defenders of the Confederacy? Well, many were, but so did many join Union armies. Finally, this area, if you notice, there's quite a bit of grass. There are also quite a few undiscovered, unmarked burials. How can that happen? Well, back in the before time, I worked for the National Park Service in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, mapping cemeteries, discovering abandoned cemeteries, and particularly mapping abandoned African American cemeteries. And often in black cemeteries in the 19th century, just like in poor white cemeteries, headstones were made of whatever materials you could find. Pieces of wood or rock, such as this, inserted in the ground. Perhaps painted, but if you are a community of enslaved African and African Americans and are not literate, or were punished or worse for demonstrating that you were literate secretly, you don't want to put the names of your loved ones on the stone itself. So a simple, humble marker like this would be what you would use. About 5-6 years ago, when I first came to Appalachian State, well, I was here earlier than that, but that's all I'll admit to. This area was littered with this kind of stone slab. Down the hill slopes, off on the sides of the cemetery area, probably over the years, especially as the maintenance of the cemetery changed its regime from the Presbyterian Church to the town of Boone. These kind of rocks, no one recognized them as headstones. They simply were rocks in the way and were tossed so they wouldn't mess up the lawnmower. Back in 2009, geophysical survey was done. Someone came by with ground penetrating radar, ran the radar waves over the ground surface in lines, band by band, across this grassy area. Those radar waves go down through the soil, and then they bounce back off bedrock. And you can use algorithms that are built into the ground penetrating radar, or GPR unit, to interpret the speed at which, and changes in the speed at which, those radar waves go down and return from bouncing off bedrock. This is one way to indicate changes in soil composition, like you dug a burial shaft and then filled it back in, or void spaces like old wells or cellars or structural foundations. And so that original survey was done. It was not that great. In 2009, that survey found 30 to 40 likely burial shafts here. A subsequent survey done within the last 5 years found that there's about 165 unmarked burial shafts in this area. 2 years ago, the university, the town of Boone, came out to lay this marker, recognizing some of the people who were buried here. These are the known, identified burials here. That is the Hardin Council Cemetery. It is a cemetery that began in the middle of the 19th century as a family cemetery. It expanded to some of the most well-known prominent families in Boone, and also reflected what Boone residents thought about the afterlife, about work and labor, about your identity as a member of Boone society, as a member of a secret society like the Masons or the Oddfellows, as a minister, and what it meant to be a woman, and what roles you had that were valued enough to be commemorated on a tombstone, and the gender disparity we see here in that. And then finally, of course, the disparity in death by race, and the segregation that was placed upon you for where you were buried. Now, there is a silver lining to the racial segregation Hardin Council Cemetery. It's this. If you noticed, quite a few of the tombstones in the cemetery, not all, but quite a few, particularly the earlier ones, the 19th century burials, are buried facing what direction? Oh, come on, what direction is that past Trent? There's Belk Library. That is west, right? Yeah, it's west. So, three are facing east. Well, by folk tradition in Appalachia, and we won't get into Appalachian mountain religion and all the blending of beliefs that took place in the mountains, but one of the folk beliefs of Appalachian mountain religion was that on the day of judgment, the day of resurrection, when Christians were raised from their graves bodily to face God, Jesus would return with the rising sun from the east. So, if that is true, the first folks in the cemetery to face their Lord and Savior are going to be the folks in the black section of the cemetery. And I think that the folks in that white section might have some things to answer for. See you next time.